4 years ago, I counted the perennial vegetables in my garden and came up with exactly 3. Last spring, I counted 19, and I have not bought a single seed packet or transplant for any of them in over 3 seasons. They just come back, year after year, without me doing a thing. That is the promise behind what I am about to share with you today. 20 vegetables the Amish have grown for generations that never need replanting. Once they are in the ground, they return on their own, sometimes for decades, producing food with almost no annual labor. Some of these you have probably heard of. A few might surprise you, and the last one on this list is a plant most Americans think of as a weed. But the Amish families I know in Lancaster County treat it like one of the most valuable crops in their garden. I have never seen it recommended in a single mainstream gardening book, and it completely changed how I think about what belongs in a food garden. I will also share a bonus technique after the list, a simple Amish method for getting perennial vegetables established faster in heavy clay soil that I learned from an Amish neighbor named Samuel and wish someone had told me 30 years ago. Let us get into it. Before we start the list, there is a reason the Amish lean so heavily on perennial vegetables, and it is not nostalgia. It is pure practicality. When you're feeding a family of 8 or 10 people with no tractor, no irrigation system, and no run to the garden center, every hour of labor matters. Perennial crops produce food without the annual cycle of tilling, seeding, transplanting, and babying seedlings through late frosts. You plant once, you manage lightly, and the harvest comes back. In the Holmes County, Ohio settlements I have visited, nearly every kitchen garden has a perennial section that has been producing for longer than most of us have been alive. One Amish farmer named Eli told me his asparagus bed was started by his grandfather and has not missed a season in over 50 years. That is the kind of return on investment that makes a perennial garden worth every minute of setup. So here is what they grow, starting with one that almost every serious gardener already knows, but very few manage correctly. Asparagus is the backbone of the Amish perennial garden, and for good reason. A well-established bed produces for 20 to 30 years with minimal care. But here is where most people go wrong. They get impatient. An Amish grower in Lancaster County told me that the biggest mistake outsiders make is harvesting too soon. The Amish rule is simple. You do not cut a single spear for the first 2 full years after planting crowns. You let the plant build its root system. In year 3, you harvest lightly for about 3 weeks. By year 4, you can harvest for the full 6 to 8 week window. Plant Jersey Knight or Mary Washington crowns 6 to 8 inches deep in trenches spaced 18 inches apart in full sun. Top dress with 2 inches of compost every fall. That patience in the beginning is what gives you decades of spring harvests without replanting a thing. This next one pairs beautifully with asparagus because it fills the same early spring window but in a completely different way. Rhubarb is one of the toughest perennial food plants you can grow, and the Amish treat it almost like infrastructure. Once it is in for life. I have seen rhubarb crowns in Amish gardens that are older than the houses next to them. Plant divisions in early spring or fall, spacing them 3 to 4 feet apart because they get large. Give them rich soil, full sun to partial shade, and a thick layer of composted manure every autumn. The key detail I learned from watching Amish families manage rhubarb is that they never harvest more than 1/3 of the stalks in any single picking, and they always pull rather than cut. You grab the stalk near the base, twist slightly, and pull it free. This is better for the crown than cutting, which can invite rot. In zones 3 through 6, rhubarb is virtually indestructible. In zones 7 and 8, give it afternoon shade and do not let the soil dry out in summer. Here's one that seems almost too simple to qualify as a vegetable, but the Amish grow it with absolute intention. Walking onions, sometimes called Egyptian walking onions or top-setting onions, are a perennial allium that produces clusters of small bulbils at the top of their stalks. The stalk bends under the weight, the bulbils touch the ground, and new plants root right where they land. That is how they walk across the garden over time. Every part of the plant is edible. The green tops in spring, the small bulbils in summer, and the underground bulbs year-round. Plant bulbils or small divisions about 6 inches apart in fall, and by the following spring you will have a self-sustaining patch that expands on its own. The Amish families I know thin them every couple of years and use the thinnings in the kitchen. One woman in a settlement near Intercourse, Pennsylvania, told me her walking onion patch had been going for over 20 years from a single handful of bulbils her mother gave her when she got married. No replanting, no fuss, just onions forever. If you're finding this useful and you want more of these deep dives into how traditional growers approach the garden differently, take a second and subscribe. I have a lot more of these coming, and I think you will get a lot out of them. All right, let us keep going. Now, most people think of horseradish as a condiment, but in Amish households, it is a full-fledged perennial vegetable. They grate the roots fresh for sauces, chop the young leaves into salads, and use it as a companion plant because its intense chemistry repels several common pests. Here's the thing about horseradish. Your challenge is not getting it to grow. Your challenge is keeping it from taking over. Plant a root cutting about 2 inches below. The surface in a corner of your garden or in a bottomless 5-gallon bucket sunk into the ground to contain the spread. Full sun, average soil, and almost zero care after that. Every fall, dig up a portion of the roots for use and leave the rest. It comes back stronger every year. I planted horseradish 4 seasons ago in a raised bed with a buried barrier, and I have harvested enough root each autumn to make a full year's supply of prepared horseradish. That is from a single original root cutting that cost me nothing. An Amish neighbor gave it to me in a paper bag and said good luck stopping it. He was not wrong. This next one is a vegetable most American gardeners have never even heard of, and it took me years to discover it. Good King Henry is an old European perennial green that the Amish in some Pennsylvania settlements have grown quietly for generations. The leaves taste similar to spinach. The young shoots can be prepared like asparagus in spring, and the plant comes back. Reliably in zones 3 through 9. Sow seeds in early spring or set out transplants 12 inches apart in rich soil. It is slow to establish in year 1, but by year 2, you will be harvesting handfuls of nutritious greens from April through June without replanting. The reason this stays under the radar is that it was never commercialized. There is no money in a plant you buy once. But that is exactly why the Amish love it. You probably already have a spot in your garden that would be perfect for this next one. Sorrel, specifically French sorrel, is a perennial green with a bright lemony flavor that comes back every spring for 6 to 8 years or more from a single planting. The Amish use it in soups, salads, and as a cooked green mixed with other milder leaves. Plant seeds or divisions in early spring 8 to 10 inches apart in partial shade to full sun. Sorrel is remarkably low maintenance. Cut the flower stalks when they appear to keep leaf production going and divide the clumps every 3 to 4 years to keep them vigorous. In my own garden, a row of 8 sorrel plants gives me more tangy salad greens from April through November than I can use. That is 8 plants planted once, producing across 3 full seasons every year. This one is going to sound familiar because you have probably pulled it out of a flower bed at some point without knowing it was edible. Daylily shoots and buds are a traditional Amish food crop in some communities. In early spring, the young shoots that emerge from the crown are sliced and sautéed like a mild green. The unopened flower buds in summer are collected and stir-fried, and they taste remarkably like green beans with a slightly sweet finish. Now, I want to be clear. We are talking about Hemerocallis species, common daylilies, not true lilies. The distinction matters because true lilies are not safe to eat. Stick with the common orange daylily that grows along roadsides across the eastern United States, or any named Hemerocallis variety. Plant divisions in spring or fall 12 to 18 inches apart in almost any soil. They spread on their own and come back without fail. An Amish family I visited near Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania, had an entire row of daylilies along their garden fence specifically for eating. They had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Here is one that works in nearly every climate zone and gives you a perennial root vegetable that most gardening books completely ignore. Jerusalem artichokes, also called sunchokes, are native North American plants related to sunflowers. They produce knobby tubers underground that taste nutty and slightly sweet, and the Amish grow them as a reliable starch crop that never needs replanting. In fact, good luck getting rid of them once they are established. Plant tubers 3 to 4 inches deep and 12 inches apart in late spring. They grow tall, 6 to 10 feet, so put them where they will not shade out other crops. The north side of the garden or along a fence is ideal. Harvest tubers in fall after the first frost, which sweetens them, but always leave a few in the ground. Those leftovers become next year's crop. I have been harvesting sunchokes from the same patch for 3 years now, and the yield increases every season. The Amish families I know roast them, mash them, and slice them raw into salads. One honest note, though. If you have digestive sensitivity to inulin, start with small servings. Sunchokes are very high in inulin and can cause discomfort if you eat too many too fast. The Amish families who grow them seem to already know this and serve them in moderate portions alongside other foods. This next one surprised me because I always thought of it as an annual, but the Amish taught me otherwise. Certain varieties of kale, particularly Dobbinton's perennial kale, are genuinely perennial in zones 6 through 9 and behave as biennials in colder zones, unlike annual kale that you replant. Every season, Dobbinton's grows as a small shrubby plant that comes back year after year and is propagated by cuttings rather than seed. Take 4 to 6 inch stem cuttings in spring, root them in moist soil, and plant them 18 inches apart. Within a year, you have a kale plant that produces tender leaves for picking nearly year-round in mild climates. I got my first cuttings from an Amish grower who had been maintaining the same mother plants for 7 or 8 years. He told me he had not planted kale from seed in longer than he could remember. Now, let me give you one that takes almost no garden space at all. Multiplier onions, sometimes called potato onions, are a perennial allium that the Amish rely on for year-round onion supply without ever buying sets or seed. You plant one bulb in fall, and by summer it is divided into a cluster of 6 to 12 bulbs. Harvest the larger ones for the kitchen and replant the smaller ones immediately. The cycle repeats itself every year, expanding your supply without any outside input. Plant bulbs 2 inches deep and 6 inches apart in fall, about 4 to 6 weeks before your first hard frost. They overwinter in the ground in zones 3 through 8 and are one of the most cold-hardy perennial vegetables you can grow. I started with a dozen bulbs 3 years ago and now have over 100 plants that I have never replanted. I just keep cycling the small ones back into the soil every harvest. Here's one that most people walk right past in the woods without a second thought. Ramps, also called wild leeks, are a native perennial allium that the Amish and Appalachian communities have harvested and cultivated for generations. The leaves and bulbs have a flavor somewhere between garlic and onion, and they emerge in early spring before almost anything else is ready to pick. The key to growing ramps successfully is replicating their woodland habitat. Plant bulbs or seeds in a shady spot under deciduous trees in rich, well-drained soil with a deep leaf mulch layer. Space bulbs 4 to 6 inches apart. Ramps are slow. From seed, expect to wait 5 to 7 years for your first meaningful harvest. From transplanted bulbs, 2 to 3 years. But once they are established, a ramp patch self-seeds and spreads on its own for decades. I put in 40 bulbs under a maple tree 4 years ago, and I am just now getting consistent spring harvests. The Amish approach to ramps teaches patience. You're building something that will outlast you. I want to take a different direction for a moment because this next plant challenges what most of us think a vegetable garden should look like. Sea kale is a European perennial brassica that the Amish in some communities grow for its young blanched shoots in spring. You mound soil or place a bucket over the crown in late winter and the shoots grow pale and tender underneath, similar to how white asparagus is produced. Harvest the blanched stalks when they are 8 to 10 inches tall. The flavor is mild and nutty, somewhere between broccoli stem and celery. Plant root cuttings called thongs in spring, 2 feet apart in well-drained soil. Sea kale is hardy in zones 4 through 8 and lives for 10 years or more. It is unusual and not many people grow it, which is exactly why I wanted to include it. An Amish grower in an Ohio settlement showed me his sea kale bed and said it was one of the lowest effort, highest reward crops in his entire garden. This one connects back to something I mentioned earlier about the Amish using every available space. Lovage is a perennial herb that the Amish treat as a vegetable because of the sheer volume of usable foliage it produces. It tastes like an intensely flavored celery, and they use the leaves and hollow stems in soups, stews, and salads all season long. A single Lovage plant can grow 4 to 6 feet tall and produce more celery-flavored greens than a dozen celery plants. It comes back every year in zones, 3 through 9, and requires almost nothing once established. Plant 1, maybe 2 at most, in a corner of your garden in rich soil. That is all you need for a family. Divide the roots every 4 to 5 years to keep it vigorous. Here's a quick one that deserves more attention. Watercress is a perennial green that the Amish grow in shallow troughs, old sinks, or any container that holds an inch or two of standing water. You do not need a stream. A wide, shallow tray and partial shade kept consistently wet will produce peppery greens from spring through fall. Plant cuttings from a store-bought bunch directly into wet soil or gravel, and they root within days. Watercress is hardy in zones 3 through 9 and self-maintains as long as the roots stay wet. I keep a small galvanized trough near my back door that produces enough watercress for daily salads from a planting I made 2 years ago. Now this next one is an Amish staple that most suburban gardeners overlook because it needs a little room. Turkish rocket is a perennial brassica that produces edible leaves, flower buds, and young seed pods, giving you 3 different harvests from a single planting. The flower buds taste similar to broccoli, and the Amish pick them just before they open. Plant seeds or divisions 18 inches apart in spring. It is aggressive, so give it a dedicated bed or a contained area. Hardy in zones 4 through 8, it requires no attention beyond an annual top dressing of compost. I have had a row of Turkish rocket for 2 seasons now, and the spring flower bud harvest alone justifies the space it takes. You might remember I mentioned rhubarb earlier. This next plant fills a similar niche, but on a much smaller scale and in a way I did not expect. Ostrich fern fiddleheads are a forage delicacy in many parts of the Northeast, but the Amish deliberately plant ostrich ferns as a perennial vegetable crop. The tightly curled fiddleheads emerge in early spring and are harvested for about a 2-week window when they are still coiled. They must be cooked thoroughly, never eaten raw. Plant divisions in a moist, shaded area 18 to 24 inches apart. They spread by underground runners and will eventually fill in a bed on their own. In zones 3 through 7, they are bulletproof. One Amish woman told me her fiddlehead patch along the north side of her barn was the first food she harvested every spring, and it had been there since before she was born. Let me share one that is specifically valuable for gardeners in warmer zones. Chayote is a perennial vine in zones 8 through 11 that produces pear-shaped green fruits used like summer squash. One vine can yield 50 to 100 fruits per season, and the root system overwinters and sends up new growth each spring. Plant a whole fruit, slightly angled, half buried in rich, well-drained soil after all frost danger has passed. Provide a strong trellis because the vine gets large. Cooler zones, you can grow chayote as a long-season annual, but in the warmer areas where many Amish communities in the South and Midwest now operate, it is genuinely perennial and never needs replanting. I have spoken with Amish families in southern Missouri who rely on chayote as a summer staple precisely because of this set-it-and-forget-it quality. Here is one more perennial green that fills a gap nothing else really does. Silvetta arugula, also called wild arugula, is a short-lived perennial that self-seeds so reliably it behaves like a permanent planting. Unlike regular arugula, which bolts and dies in hot weather, Silvetta stays low, produces deeply lobed leaves with a stronger peppery flavor, and flowers without becoming bitter. Sow seeds shallowly in spring or fall, 8 inches apart. After the first year, you never sow again. The plants drop seed, new rosettes appear, and you always have arugula. I scattered a packet of Silvetta seeds 3 years ago in a partly shaded bed, and it has maintained itself ever since, providing spicy salad greens from early spring through late fall with 0 replanting. We are getting close to the end of the list now, and these last few are the ones that changed how I think about what a perennial garden can be. Skirret is an old root vegetable that has mostly disappeared from modern gardens, but survives in Amish communities where traditional crops are passed down through families. The roots are white, sweet, and about the size of a finger clustered together like a hand. You cook them like parsnips or carrots, and the flavor is notably sweeter. Plant divisions or seedlings 12 inches apart in rich, moist soil. Harvest outer roots in fall and leave the central crown undisturbed to regrow. A skirret plant will keep producing for 5 to 8 years this way. Eli, the same Amish farmer I mentioned at the start, had a skirret bed alongside his asparagus. He told me his family had been growing it for at least 4 generations, and he could not understand why nobody else bothered with it. After tasting the roasted roots, neither could I. This next one might be the most overlooked perennial root crop in the entire list. Groundnut, also called Apios americana, is a native North American vine that produces chains of small edible tubers underground. The tubers taste like a cross between potato and turnip with a slightly nutty quality, and the vine also produces edible flowers and protein-rich beans. Plant tubers 4 inches deep and 12 inches apart along a fence or trellis in spring. The vine grows vigorously and the tubers develop over 2 to 3 seasons before they reach harvest size. Once established, you harvest a portion each fall and the rest regenerates on its own. This is a plant indigenous peoples cultivated for thousands of years, and the Amish communities I have visited in Pennsylvania grow it as a low-maintenance protein and starch crop. It thrives in zones 3 through 7 and tolerates partial shade. I planted groundnut along a fence line 2 years ago and the vines are already lush. Next fall will be my first real harvest and I am looking forward to it. Now, here is the one I told you about at the beginning, and I am being completely honest when I say it changed my perspective on what belongs in a food garden. The plant is stinging nettle. Yes, the same plant that raises welts on your skin if you brush against it barehanded. Most American gardeners rip it out on sight. But every Amish kitchen garden I have visited in Lancaster County has a deliberately maintained nettle patch, usually along a fence line or in a back corner where it will not ambush anyone by accident. Here is why. Stinging nettle is one of the most nutritious leafy greens on the planet. It is higher in iron, calcium, and protein than spinach. The young spring shoots, harvested with gloves when they are 4 to 8 inches tall, are blanched for 30 seconds in boiling water, which completely neutralizes the sting. After blanching, the leaves are tender, mild, and taste similar to a rich spinach with a slightly mineral quality. The Amish dry nettle leaves for winter tea, cook the fresh greens into soups and casseroles, and use nettle as a compost activator because the leaves are so nitrogen-rich, they accelerate decomposition. An Amish woman named Mary, whose garden I visited 3 springs ago, handed me a bowl of nettle soup and watched me take the first spoonful with obvious amusement. She knew I was hesitant. It was one of the best soups I have ever had. She told me her nettle patch had been growing in the same spot for over 30 years. She never replanted it, never fertilized it, and never watered it. She just harvested the spring shoots with leather gloves and let the rest grow tall enough to attract beneficial insects, because nettle is also a host plant for several species of butterflies and parasitic wasps. To start your own patch, plant nettle root, divisions or seeds in a contained area. I mean that seriously. Use a buried barrier or plant it in a bed bordered by hardscape because it spreads aggressively by underground runners. Space root divisions 8 inches apart in rich soil. Partial shade is fine. Nettle tolerates zones 2 through 9 and is virtually unkillable once established. For 30 years of free, highly nutritious spring greens and the best garden compost activator you will ever find, that is a pretty extraordinary return on zero effort. This is the kind of crop that makes you rethink what a food garden is supposed to look like. The Amish never had any confusion about it. They have been eating nettle since before organic was a word. Now, before I give you that bonus tip I promised, let me share a few patterns I noticed in my own gardening that these perennial vegetables corrected. No judgment here. I did every one of these myself for years. The first pattern is relying entirely on annuals and treating the vegetable garden as something you start from scratch every spring. I used to spend entire weekends every March and April tilling, planting, and transplanting. A perennial section eliminates half that labor. The Amish figured out long ago that the most efficient garden is one where a significant portion of the food comes from plants that are already in the ground when the season begins. The second pattern is dismissing unfamiliar crops because they are not in the seed catalogs. Plants like Skirret, Good King Henry, and groundnut are absent from most commercial sources, so we assume they are not worth growing. The Amish pass these crops hand to hand, generation to generation, because they produce reliably without annual cost or effort. The third pattern is thinking of perennial vegetables as low-yield specialty items that cannot really contribute to feeding a family. Once you have a mature asparagus bed, a rhubarb patch, a sunchoke row, a nettle corner, and a few clumps of sorrel and lovage, you have food coming out of the garden for months before you even plant your first tomato. That is not a novelty, that is a head start. Now here is the bonus technique I promised. I learned this from an Amish neighbor named Samuel who gardens on heavy clay soil in Lancaster County. When he establishes any perennial vegetable, whether it is asparagus crowns, rhubarb divisions, or sunchoke tubers, he digs the planting hole twice as wide as he normally would and fills the bottom 3 inches with a mixture of coarse sand and aged compost in roughly equal parts. He calls it giving the roots a place to breathe. What this does is create a drainage pocket directly beneath the crown of the plant, preventing the waterlogging that kills so many perennials in their first winter in clay soil. The roots establish into that loose, well-drained zone first, and by the time they grow out into the surrounding clay, the plant is strong enough to handle the denser soil. I started using Samuel's method 3 years ago when I put in a new asparagus bed, and my first-year crown survival went from about 70%, which I thought was normal, to 95%. On clay soil, that difference is the gap between a productive perennial bed and a frustrating one. If you garden on heavy soil, this 10-minute extra step during planting will save you years of replanting and disappointment. If this list gave you a new way of thinking about your garden, I would love to hear which plants you are going to try first. Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you want more of these deep dives into traditional growing methods that actually work, subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. I have got a lot more to share. Thanks for spending your time with me today. 20 vegetables, planted once, producing for years. That is the kind of garden the Amish have always built, and now you can build one too. I will see you in the next one.